Good morning, everyone. I'm Eric Anderson, Chief Technology Officer at SynMax. I want to thank you for watching our video. We're going to be sitting here today with Robert Cram. Robert is a production engineer with over 40 years of oil and gas experience. We're going to dive deep into different topics that commonly impact energy trading, particularly on the natural gas and oil side. We're going to talk about production freeze-offs. We're going to talk about DTILs and really dive into his experience to the benefit of our customers. So welcome, Robert. Thank you for joining.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, maybe we could start off by just unpacking your background a little bit. I know you've been in oil and gas for 40 years, and you are currently a production engineer. Is that right?
Yes, I guess technically I'm probably in the retired consulting mode right now as opposed to the active operator mode. Worked for 40 years in the oil and gas business so far. Started in 1981 after graduating from A&M, and went to work for ARCO initially, which was a great company. Had a lot of opportunities to work in various locations in the U.S. and ended up in Alaska. So I worked up on the North Slope for a while, and then went to work ultimately with ARCO in Sahara Desert. So it's quite a
very different place,
quite a range of locations there. And once ARCO was purchased by BP, I ended up working, decided I'd go do something different, and I ended up working for Oxy, Anadarko, and BHP before I finally kind of hung things up in 2019, and just doing a little consulting since then.
Very good. And how much of that experience were you on site on the well pads? I imagine if you're shipping out to Alaska in the Sahara Desert, they want you kind of near the action. Is that right?
Yes, most of my experience was either in production engineering, which is usually a blend of about 50% office, 50% well. But a lot of I gravitated more towards the field side. So I actually ended up in some operational type of roles too. But the rough cut overall, my whole experience was probably about closer to 60+% of the time was in the field. When I worked all totaled in North Africa for about 13 years on a 28 and 28 rotation where we were out in the field out there. And so the thing that I always focused on was, you've got to understand what causes things to happen in order to make recommendations on what you want to change. And it's really hard, in my opinion, to do that when you're not able to physically get out and see what's going on.
So. Yeah, I can imagine. Speaking of things happening on well pads, I want to talk about freeze-offs. So okay. Usually at least once a year, many times, multiple times a year, we have a drop of production that could be multiple BCF a days, and it happens after we get a real steep cold front coming into a production area. A lot of times it happens in Texas, where I know that wellheads are not as prepared for those type of events, but it happens in the Northeast too. So, what is actually happening during a freeze-off event?
Freeze impact. It's interesting. There's certain terms that get used in the operations to kind of label events that happen on a well. That get sometimes a lot of different things get lumped into this freeze-off label. So if you start maybe with the basics, whenever we produce a well, initially the pressure on the wellhead is going to be much higher than the pressure I need in the flow line. Okay, so I have to regulate that pressure. The way we do that in the oil and gas business is with choke, and so the choke is taking the pressure at the wellhead and dropping it down to something before it's going through the production facilities. And most wells will have two chokes actually, where you'll have one to take it comes right off the production tree, and then another one that's some secondary choke that's in the system to provide a slug protection and protect lower pressure rated equipment downstream. And so the rule of thumb in the choke world is to take about half the pressure off with each choke. And the reason that is the Joule-Thomson effect is whenever I reduce the pressure on something, I greatly increase the temperature drop. So this is the the thermodynamic exchange, and that temperature drop is what's causing the freeze off, because you're going to get into what we call the hydrate zone. And so physical freezing of the water is possible because you can get way below the freeze point of the water. But you're dealing with the pressure, the temperature, and the flow rate. Those are these three things that are determining where you are on this kind of a hydrate chart, if you will. So a hydrate is actually looks more like a snow crystal, and it's when the crystals of ice form with encapsulated methane inside the structure, and it can be a very dangerous thing because once you thaw that out, you release an enormous volume. It's like semi LNG process. You're shrinking this volume quite a bit, and then when you heat it back up, it gets big.
You get a massive expansion.
Yeah.
Where in the equipment does this happen? You said there's two different chokes, one at the wellhead, one later.
The wellhead is the one that happens the most often, but when you're producing, remember the reservoir that's down below is very hot. And so when you've got a lot of liquids and you're carrying up and early on in the well, you got a lot of wellhead temperature. So you can take this big delta P, the big pressure drop across this choke, without freezing stuff up. But then as production rates decline, your temperature at the wellhead also declines. And that's the part people usually miss. They expect, you got this 140 degree F wellhead all the time. Well, no, you may only had that when you were making 2,500 barrels a day.
Gotcha.
Now that you're only making 80 barrels a day, the wellhead may only be 75 degrees.
So does that then mean that freeze-offs are more likely on more mature wells, regardless of how old or new the equipment is on site?
Yeah. The freeze-off potential is much higher as you get into the lower production. The other reason is the operations staff are paying attention to those high-rate boomer wells that just came online. They don't want to,
the lower-paying wells get less attention.
They don't want to get their rear end in a crack because they, got three of the brand new wells frozen off. Okay, so they're going to be making sure that those guys are in good shape. The lower rate wells don't get the attention, and they're easier to freeze. So typically what we'll do is we'll have an injection of like methanol or some kind of chemical treatment upstream of the choke to depress, just the way antifreeze works in your car. You're just depressing this freeze point of the material to try and keep it from creating this problem as you're going through it.
Gotcha. And is this something they do all the time, or is it a certain time of year they come in and add this capability?
No, it's too expensive to do it all year, so you only do it when there's this freezing potential, and that's one of the problems is you got equipment that's been sitting out there and hasn't been running all year long, and then somebody's got to get out there and get it all. You got some chemical injection pump that's supposed to have a piston that's, kind of thing. You're making some injection on a routine frequency. And it just takes a little bit to get this stuff going again sometimes. So that's one of the problems. But the other problem is that well conditions change when composition changes. And the temperature, pressure, and flow rate are the first 3 points, and the fourth point is composition. So as you're producing this reservoir, the crude or natural gas liquids, their composition changes. And so
becomes more gassy.
It could be that you got more paraffin that's coming through the system. It could be that you've got some additional other types of deposits that are forming in the system that are tending to gunk up the process. And so more mature wells are going to have more issues with these deposits forming in the system. The reason I started this discussion about how freeze-offs is a kind of all-encompassing term, one of the biggest problems is the controls side. The production side, that part of the equipment is designed for production to continue flowing through it. So whatever I'm doing is going to go through that side. If I'm injecting methanol, it's staying with the system going all the way through there. The control side is sampling things, and it's usually static parts of the loop. So if I get some liquids into a little stainless steel line that goes to a pressure sensor that's supposed to shut something down if it goes to this, or open something up if the pressure, and I get a little freeze plug in that, now the rest of
Shuts
the
down the
system
whole
says,
thing.
hey, this
Yeah.
is not working
There's
right.
some kind of a fault, so we're shutting down for safety.
Yeah, and so those are the parts that can really drive folks nuts, is keeping all their control systems de-inventoried of any liquids whatsoever, so that everything's dry enough to work. As the industry has converted to more electronic controls, that changes some, but in order to do that, you really have to get out of the solar-powered well sites and get into more constant power,
Ones that are connected to the grid.
yeah,
Okay.
to do that. But the freeze-off potential is usually related to hydrates. There's another piece of that, downhole heating, that has been tried a couple of times. It was something that I was actually working on since I retired. We have a patent that we had done on a wellbore heater where, people, you can cool capillary tubing inside of that has a piece of heat trace that's inside it. So then in the wintertime, you turn it on. Like BP has just finished electrifying a very large number of their well sites in South Texas. And so it gives them this opportunity, if they want to install some heat trace and want to do something that's trying to mitigate those problems in a more controllable manner.
Gotcha. These heating systems can be installed and then remotely controlled whenever there's a weather event.
Yeah.
And this is a proactive approach, or is this reactive? They turn these heaters on after the event occurs to try and get it flowing again, or they do it proactively when the storm's coming in?
Don't misunderstand. The wellbore heaters are very, it's rare that we install those. Okay. We'll do it on surface lines. We will wrap the surface lines to try and prevent freeze up from gas lift situations and things like that. But downhole heating for preventing the freeze up on the production side is just kind of an emerging technology, I would say.
Gotcha.
It's just not used enough.
You talked a little bit about the composition of the well can have an impact on its freeze off. So is it safe to say that the wetter the well, the more extra liquids we're getting in, the more likely it is to freeze off, or is that not the general formula?
I would say, yeah, in general, that's probably very true. That your liquid yield is a big part of that. But what happens is the liquid composition can change. In other words, say I was only making 5% water or 2% water. Initially, I had this really low water cut. And then as the pressure has declined in the well for some reason, I'm actually producing more water as I'm going along in time. Especially in gas situations, sometimes you'll find that where you have fracked into something that has a little bit of connection with a wetter zone, that you really didn't want the water from the lower part of this maybe it's the same shale area, but it's just not as much hydrocarbons and more water in the lower part of it for some reason. You just you have to watch that compositional piece over time. And the difficulty is for folks like the Cinmax group, is it's a hard thing to really get a good grasp of what the liquids production are in water, to be able to understand that over time. But some of the reporting methods that are used for standard tracking of like wells in Texas, will give you that data, but it's in a very delayed mode. It comes out.
Yeah, it's in the TRC data. They have a column for water, but it's generally not something that people model.
Yeah.
Freeze-offs they're an important event at the time they're occurring, but they're to the extent that you would want to try and model it with the water production of each well and understand at a well level what the freeze-off is going to be, that's probably not beneficial. It's most beneficial to look at it as an aggregate number. So,
exactly. If you could see as a big trend for that area, whether it's in the Eagle Ford or the Marcellus or whatever you're looking at, do those wells tend to stay at a routine water cut as they're going over time, or is the water cut tending to increase or decrease?
And so when you have growing water along with aging production,
then
you have a great mix for freeze-offs.
You are going to be and so you got it. That's it right there.
So what's the solution? A freeze-off happens. What does the operator do to remediate it? How long does it take? And what are the constraints, right? So, different freeze-off events, we can usually with a degree of accuracy predict how much production is going to come offline. But the harder part of predicting a freeze-off is how long it's going to take for that production to return.
Well, hopefully you won't think I'm being a smartass about this, but in the North Slope, there's like permafrost down for, multiple hundreds of feet in the stuff. So what we called them at the time, when we would create a popsicle by getting something shut in that didn't get diesel pickled down the tubing fast enough, you could have an ice plug that might be 1,200 feet long. Okay, it took a long time with the hot oiler to circulate enough stuff around that thing to clear that plug out of there.
Yeah.
On these freeze-offs that you're talking about, we're just talking on surface piping in general. That's where the freeze-offs are going to be, in surface piping for these ones. The clearing process is to try and get, first off, you've got to wait. Okay, if you're in an area that's produces that has this freeze-off problem, but you also have a change in ambient temperature, just wait.
Wait for spring?
Hopefully not that long, but just wait till it warms up enough so that you can get some benefit and not be fighting yourself where you're trying to clean something out and then it's frozen.
Sure. So you have to wait for the weather event.
You want
to remediate it, and you don't want it to immediately freeze up again while you're going to the next well.
Because hot oiler fires and things that are related to when hot oiler shows up on location, and hot oiler is just an acronym. They may be pumping water, okay, but they're heating it to a very high temperature with this large propane burner that's in the truck.
Okay, and are they injecting that into the stream to freeze off?
And then you're circulating it. So imagine you had a pipe that had a big freeze plug in it. You had to clear it with some kind of a circulating hot fluid. You're pumping the fluid out the end of this capillary, and then it's coming back out, and you're taking the returns back to a tank, some tank at location where you can look at it, regulate it,
monitor the material coming out,
out,
make sure the freeze off is gone.
But if you have a hydrate problem, if you heat it up too fast, you can actually create an overpressure situation for your piping because you expand the gas behind a part of the plug. And so it's something that you have to take your time with on making sure you don't screw something up. So that's why during these freeze problems, it's not like everybody just jumps up and runs out to go clear them all. They all go, okay, well, we're going to have to clear that as soon as it warms up.
Yeah.
Because if they do it while it's still frozen or getting worse, they know they can be taken what many people would view as an unnecessary risk.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. One thing we've noticed with freeze-offs, and this is completely anecdotal, but I'm wondering if there's any science behind it, is that once wells return into service, we usually see a bit of a production bump, right? And, I've been in energy trading for 10 years. I've heard a lot of hearsay and rumors about why that is, and armchair geologists talking about, it's because the reservoir pressure is building up or something like that. First of all, is there any truth to that claim, that you usually get a better performing well after a freeze-off? And if it is, what's the cause of that?
Whenever you see something that's looking like a production bump, what my tendency is my training is to look back on something that's a cumulative type of plot, as opposed to just looking at rate time. Because if you looked at the cumulative production that you made, counting your shut-in time, you may find that, I got a lot of increased rate on the exact same forecast for the cumulative production as before. So I just accelerated maybe some of my production now by making up for what I was shut in, because my reservoir pressure near wellbore increased during the shut-in. So the thing with shale wells that are different, and so I have to be careful here. If somebody's listening to the podcast and says, well, that's not what happens in the Gulf of Mexico, well, there's not a lot of shale wells, I'm sure,
For sure.
So they, in shale, in non-conventional production, you only get what you contact with the fractures for the most of these. So the permeability in the formation is so low that you have to really get enough fracture system out there to contact the rock in order to produce it. So near the fracture face that's been created out in the rock from the hydraulic fracturing operation, there's this huge pressure gradient. Okay, so as I move away from this fracture face, I'm building back to very high pressures in the reservoir. When I shut that well in, that pressure is trying to equalize. It just takes time. If that well ends up being down for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, being shut in, its pressure is going to build up significantly above what happens when you just shut it in for a 1 day maintenance issue on it. So that buildup in pressure, when I put the well back online, I'm going to have a period of time where it's going to be trying to make up for what I lost.
That's interesting.
Okay.
So it is true. So there is a bump in production after a freeze-off event.
You're going to always have the ability to produce at a higher rate. Now the other thing is, when we freeze up a well, the operator, the last thing he wants to do is do all that damn stuff again that it took to clear that ice plug the first time. So he is going to go out there and make certain he's keeping that well online so he doesn't have to do it again, because his boss is going to, hey, hit the road. I got to find somebody else. I can't do this twice every time it happens,
Yeah.
So remember I told you pressure, temperature, flow rate, composition. Well, you can't change the composition, but I can affect the flow rate if I leave the choke open a little bit more, which is giving me a little bit more temperature and less pressure drop.
Okay.
So
there's two effects here. So the reservoir itself is actually increasing its pressure and producing more gas after a freeze-off, but also the people who remediate the freeze-off,
they don't want it to happen
they're opening
again
up the
right
choke
then.
so much.
They want to make up for what they lost.
Yeah.
Because that's the finance part of them, right?
Yeah, for
but
sure.
They don't want it to happen again.
And they don't want to get fired.
And they don't want to get run off.
Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, this is a little bit off script, but let's talk about chokes. How often do operators adjust chokes, and for what reasons?
We're going to need another podcast to do that.
Okay, maybe very high level.
But
do they ever do it for economic reasons? Do they ever pull their chokes and open them up because prices are good?
The smartest thing to look at is the change. When I came out of college and broke out in the oil field in 1981, there was a huge number of wells on what we called the Four Corners area of New Mexico, Colorado, Texas.
Yeah, the San Juan Basin.
Yeah. All those wells were sitting up there with basically just back pressure regulators instead of chokes installed. And so the flow lines that they're connected to this big pipeline distribution system, as I took more out of those to maintain the pressure on that system. So those types of automated controls with the pipeline system, we still do that in some way for the chokes at the heads when you're coming out. Fixed chokes, which are manually, I got to remove the actual choke bean itself. So,
so it's a big operation to change the choke.
I can shut the well in, pop the choke,
Yeah.
put a new one in. Or more commonly, there'll be some kind of adjustable choke. So I've got a hand wheel, and I can make a change. The choke setting is, and there's a bajillion types of internals to keep from having them glittery or handle sand or whatever. But the choke change strategy, if you look in the SPE, the Society of Petroleum Engineers publications, you'll see hundreds of papers probably written on, well, you should never change the pressure by more than 250 psi per day, or should never. You'll see all these.
And what's the reason behind that? Is it damage to the reservoir?
It's usually based on trying to get this holy grail of maximum economic rate. And so you want to get the economics maximized without significantly impacting your ultimate production.
Okay, so if I'm hearing what you're saying, it would probably not be a good strategy for operators to move their chokes around too much based on the price of the product?
It depends on where they are in the well. So when you talk about shale wells, unconventional wells, you initially bring them on, and the rates are really high. And so these rates, as they're declining, then you'll see the production plots sort of flatten out. You've seen this a number of times,
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure.
Thousands.
Okay. So when I get into this flatter part of the curve, responding to market conditions, really, it doesn't.
It's a bad idea.
No, it doesn't matter at all. You go ahead and do whatever you
Okay.
need to do to make sure that you're optimizing your economics of your business. Early on, in this early phase, we all get greedy, and we want to go. I want my bait back now. I want to get all this stuff back right now. And so that's the time when we have this battle of how much is too much on opening a choke up and what speed I should get there. And so the truth, in my opinion, and this is just, we'll put the
disclaimer
out there now. This
Yeah,
is,
we can handle
the
that.
opinions are of Robert Cram, not of Cinmax or Payout Well Services. Is my own opinions, but my opinion on this one is that we don't look enough at the things that make each well a little bit unique, whether it's the geology or whether it's the lateral length or whether it's the stimulation technique or the fluid composition or what. We don't look at that enough. We try to be a little bit more, well, all the wells perform kind of all the same. We try to have one choke strategy. We use it for everything. And the truth is every well will have a little bit, in my opinion, every well is going to have a little bit of that sweet spot on each well that you're going to find that you can make better rate if you'll leave it right there for the position it is right now. And then you go forward in time and you find the next one. Where's the next sweet spot in? And the truly good operators are the ones, the pumpers that do that. They know where that is.
They manage each well.
And they get real protective of, no, I don't want to change that. I know how it works. So.
Gotcha. That was a good segue into choking. I've always wondered about that. I remember a few years ago there was a lot of speculation that operators were managing production through choking. So this provides a lot of color on that. Kind of related to freeze-offs, let's also talk about shut-ins, just real briefly. So shut-ins are extremely economical, right? We've had a lot of success just building economic models about when operators are going to shut in. And the public ones, they're very open about shut-in strategies and making sure they're optimizing their assets fully. Are there any risks that they're taking to the reservoir when they shut these things in? And you talked about individual wells kind of having a sweet spot, right? Are there a certain class of wells, newer, older, liquid-rich, drier, where shut-ins are more or less effective?
I guess I'll divide it into two categories. One is well construction risks, the things that have related to this, and then the ones that are in the chemistry risk. Okay, so construction risk. When I shut in a well, remember we talked a little bit about the liquids changing over time as a well produces. The liquid volumes can change. People think that these mile-long laterals are drilled and they're a single incline and they're just this one straight smooth hole that went, you see all the animations and it's just this long straight smooth hole that goes right through the stuff all the way. And, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but that's a bunch of
It's a bit messier?
That's a bunch of hooey, yeah. So the well borers, they do their best to stay in the zone. Okay, that's really what the first target is, to make sure they're not getting out of the production zone.
Yeah, the formation itself might actually
the
have a little
formation
bit of
itself
imperfections
moves around, but the well bore walks up and down and left and right. It moves as you're going through the thing. Geology rules, period. So if Chuck Kaiser's listening out there, he was one of my, I call him geopsychics, that trained me on some of the geology piece. And so that was one of his sayings, geology rules, and he's right. So the bit's going to walk to where it's able to make its progress easiest. And so that change sometimes results in a pretty significant change in elevation along the length of that lateral. People just absolutely refuse to think about the fact that when they shut a well in and it builds up liquids, that they may have sections of that well that had cleaned up initially when I was flowing 2,000 barrels a day, and now I've pushed liquids into it, and it doesn't have enough oomph anymore to unload all that stuff.
Oh, jeez.
Okay? So the mechanical piece of it is a very real risk. And, you talk about shoe laterals, these other things that happen. You get these more substantial mechanical impact pieces out there. That becomes an issue. And so it's become an issue to the point that some companies, I guess Hess would be one of them, they've instrumented entire wellbores, along the section of their cased hole with pressure gauges, just so they can just try and see. Now, granted, it's hard to do this because you're dealing with something that's relatively horizontal.
Yeah.
So you're trying to see a pressure gradient along this path. It's not really very easy to measure, but some people have instrumented capillary strings and stuck them out into the laterals a long ways just so they can do that, to try and get a gradient survey, if you will, of while the well's producing, where those liquids are building.
So it's higher and higher pressure the closer you get to the borehole.
No, the pressure, so let's say I have a mile-long lateral, but right in the middle, I have a big dip in the way it got drilled. If I fill that up with water, it's a lot harder to, I got to kind of percolate my bubbles, because see, the velocity as you get these lower rates, the other thing people don't realize is, if I drill a conventional vertical well, maybe I only have 50 feet where I'm spreading this 80, 100 barrels a day over. If I drill a long 1 mile lateral, I've got a long distance I'm spreading this lower volume over, so the rate at one point in the lateral can be very low. I don't have enough velocity.
Yeah. If you get a dip, you could accidentally damage your well.
And so I get bubbles coming through it. And there's videos out there of people where they've taken downhole cameras and they see the bubbles coming through the liquids going, yeah, that thing's full of fluid. And so getting that unloaded requires a lot of work to get down there with nitrogen and foam and stuff and blow that stuff all out of there and get it to where it'll stay clean. So
there is significant risk to shutting a well in.
There is a risk, and it will vary based on how much liquids that area is making.
And also how long the lateral
is. And how long the lateral is.
Okay. So does that mean that shut-ins are mostly done on shorter lateral, mature, drier wells?
No. It would be nice if you could do that, but the shut-in activities are almost always driven by some kind of economic decision, not reservoir-based.
And there have been examples where an economic decision created a geological problem.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's documented cases where wells got shut in and then came back on. Things were bad. That's not an uncommon field thing.
That's interesting, because it seems like operators now are trying to make more economic decisions on their wells, right? Especially in natural gas, we have what's called a very steep contango curve, right? Yeah. So operators want to produce when the price is good for gas, which is generally in the wintertime, and they don't want to produce in the summertime. And one of the tools they're using, especially in the Northeast, is shutting wells in.
Yeah. And so you may have a situation where you don't have the kind of liquid buildup. If you have natural gas systems, they do some weird things. I actually was on a well where I watched this. When a certain liquids that we produce in natural gas, under reservoir temperatures and pressures, they'll convert back to a gas. Okay? So they're a liquid when I get them up here. They'll evaporate pretty quick, but they're a gas when I put them back under pressure and temperature downhole. And so you can have these liquid things that come into the well bore, if you're not dealing with water, but certain natural gas liquid systems that will actually collapse back and turn into a vapor downhole. Well, those wells aren't going to be hurt hardly at all, right? Because they're going to go back to a more native state system. When I put that well back on, it's going to come back in as gas, and I'm going to be able to clean it up. It's the ones that have the water production that really have the potential for this mechanical blockage situation. The natural gas wells, as opposed to the oil wells, big difference here. So when you talk contango market, you're talking about gas forecasting.
Yep, definitely not oil.
You're not in the oil world. And so in the gas world, what you're looking for is is the gravity of the condensate that they're making, what kind of natural gas liquids, when they're looking at their total NGL yields, what kind of stuff are they getting out of the ground. And those, with coupled with how much water they're making, is whether or not they're taking any risk. When you shut in a well, like I said in the first part, whether you're going to, it's going to feed in per ton. So if I'm in a contango market and I'm selling gas at, 203 an M right now, and I know I can sell it at 380 if I just wait 2 months. It doesn't take a PhD to go do the math on this one and go, hey, let's shut this thing in for a while. At the wellbore at a higher price.
Yep.
And so it's, it's, in my opinion, it's good financial management to do that.
But not always appropriate for every well.
Exactly, and that's the whole key. Is it needs to not be just statement.
Gotcha. This is actually a good segue into my next question. I want to talk about delayed TILs, which is another form of managed production besides shut-ins that operators are increasingly using. So there's been a lot of evidence recently that the practice of delay tilling, so after the frac crew leaves, you don't yet bring that well into production, sometimes for 6 months or more. I guess my first question is, what do you think of this overall as a strategy?
When we talked about the production deferment, I told you there was this mechanical piece and then there's this chemistry piece. I want to just touch a little bit on this chemistry piece because that ties to this. Without getting really detailed, interfacial tension is one of the things that comes up between hydrocarbons and water and formation, the things that affect fluids coming out of the formation. There are chemical ways that you can help get things out of the way in the rock so the hydrocarbons can come in easier, okay? And when they do hydraulic fracturing, sometimes they'll pump the interfacial tension additives. One of the first patents I ever got was in the Arco days, was for in the San Juan Basin, way to help coal fines migrate back through the pack that we created with the proppant on the fracs. And it turned out that also had an interfacial tension change so that I could de-water the coal seam faster. And if you ever work around coal seams from a natural gas standpoint, you'll see that you de-water these coal seams and then the gas production starts. And so what you're doing is you're getting the liquids, and I know that's quite a step from your question, but it's the way to help you see the concept. If you go look at the production profiles, you'll see these massive volumes of water coming out of the ground, and the gas is not very high, and then the gas comes up and up and up and up, and then the water keeps going down. Well, that in the mechanism is I'm getting the water out of the way. Think of it like that's the easiest way to describe it, so that the gas can flow into the wellbore. So we call it like water block or relative permeabilities, all kind of different technical terms for it. But the key is I'm getting the water out of the way to make room for the hydrocarbons. In these shut-ins, what I don't want to do is I don't want to force a whole bunch of water into that reservoir
And not be able to get it back out.
Block the hydrocarbon paths that I've created.
Yeah, so just to give some context here, obviously during the frac job, there's an enormous amount of water, proppant, and sand that gets injected underground, and that stays underground, right, until they till the well. And sometimes these DTILs can last 6 months or more. So you're saying the risk is, right, I push all this water underground, which the water is an inhibitor to being able to get the hydrocarbons out.
It can be.
And if I push this water under there, and if it, I mean, I don't know the correct geological terms, but if it seeps enough into my formation to the point of where I can't get it out, then I've just damaged my well.
You can't. You can screw it up from a production capacity standpoint. So the the chemicals that they're using to help prevent that, some of those chemicals, they view that as a soak period. In other words, they're going to pump these chemicals with the fracturing fluids, and it's designed to give it time to permeate further away from the fracture face and help produce a higher permeability effect to the hydrocarbons.
Okay, so what you just described almost sounds like a countervailing effect, right,
Yeah.
to the watering problem,
So-
which is I've given more time for my chemicals to work their magic and improve the reservoir overall. So what's the net balance? I mean, do we know? Is
Well,
this...
the difficulty I have with all those kind of things is it's easy to do those kind of studies in a lab, but geology rules, okay? And so thinking that, you can even come close to simulating what's really happening in the laboratory is probably, you're a little bit off the page of reality, but you're doing your best to get something that's helping you to obtain a better permeability to the hydrocarbons. The secondary piece of this is when I shut in a well, and it's also chemistry related. If I shut in a well that I've already been producing, and I leave it for a long time, the deposits that were temperature based can form significantly in the upper part of the wellbore. You can shut in a well in Eagleford, in some of the areas, and within a day, you've got huge plugs of paraffin because you have no temperature, no flow rate, no liquids to carry things away. So it's very dependent on what could be happening from a deposit standpoint to make sure that you haven't created this big operational problem for yourself where you got to go back and clean up.
Okay. I'm guessing I'm not going to get an answer to this next question, but it is a question that I get asked all the time. I just got asked it in our webinar recently. So I've got to ask it, but
Okay.
It sounds like it's so complex, it's going to be dependent on the region and the well and whatnot. In general, is there a limit to how long you can delay till a well? We've seen them delayed till for 6 months or more. Theoretically, could I delay it for a year? Would that cause any damage? Could I delay it for 2 years, right? Like, is there a theoretical upper limit on how long you can have a detail?
That's a really good question.
It's the $1 million question.
The short version is that a frac job is designed to create a pathway. Most of the fracs that we pump now are slip fracs, so the amount of material that's in the fluid that's carrying the sand, the proppant that's creating the pathway, that's not very high volume. Most of it's water with some kind of friction reducer and maybe some this interfacial tension chemistry things, to recover this water or get it out of the way. But when I shut the well down after the frac, the formation wants to close on the proppant that we've pumped in there, okay? The stress that it creates closing on the proppant is a function of the pressure in the fracture that I've created. When I put the well online, obviously the pressure in that fracture goes down, all right? The fracture becomes a low pressure point, so the formation can flow into it. As I produce it, it's going to crack, some of that proppant. It's going to, and some of the formation around it, it's going to crush some. There's some degradation that happens. But as I'm leaving it shut in, it's going to just sit there. Now, one of the things that in the old days we used to be worried about was proppant settling. So when you would leave the well shut in after the initial frac and not put it back online and right off the bat, we were worried about the proppant falling vertically into the bottom of the crack, because some of these cracks are really tall, okay? And so there is some issue.
I just have to ask, how tall? I always imagine it like a crack, like, millimeters wide.
Well, in slickwater fracking, the width of the cracks are very small. Okay, because we don't have a viscous fluid, so we're using rate to overcome to get enough hydraulic force to crack and place this material from the wellbore. But and I'm saying this because somebody that's listening to this and talking about gelled crosslink kind of frac material, they're going to say, "Oh, this is a bad idea to leave that well shut in for a year." And I would imagine nobody recommend that for gelled crosslink material. But in slickwater fracs, the fracture closes so quickly around the proppant that I don't think there's chance for anything to settle. So the time factor of leaving things shut in are not too high of conductivity. But the word that you were saying there's a geologic word. The petroleum engineering word that you're looking for is called imbibition. And so this fluid gets imbibed into the rock as it's sitting there. Same way you take a paper towel, put it into sucking it up. So that liquid that's sitting in that crack is going to get imbibed into the rock a certain distance until it reaches some kind of equilibrium and it's going to stop. Well, the imbibition process into these really tight rocks can take a long time. Okay, so leaving it shut in for a very long time, you best abso-freaking-lutely know what the reaction is between the fluids that you're using and the fluids that are in the formation. Okay, so if you can convince yourself absolutely that I'm not going to form any scales or any potential for a reaction with some other water chemistry that's in the ground versus the water chemistry I injected. Because I guarantee you, Bubba, you can mix surface and subsurface waters and you can make some really bad stuff. There's reservoirs all over the world that have been destroyed because of the interaction between a surface water chemistry and a subsurface water chemistry.
It's interesting. It's leaving me with the impression that detailing, doing it correctly, is a proficiency in a technology unto itself, right? You mentioned two different types of fracs, slickwater fracs versus gel fracs, I think you called them. Right? And then you also talked about you need to have great knowledge of exactly what chemicals you're going to encounter underground. So it's almost like this is another technological advancement that operators could become potentially proficient in.
Yeah,
is developing a frac that works well with a detail.
They're using their reservoir as the lab, if you will. Okay,
it's an expensive way to do it.
It is, but I mean that's the reality is you don't have to wait. Yeah, I know. You find the answer.
And there's always some level of disconnect between the lab and the reservoir, like you talked about. Yeah. But the hard part for the operators, right, is all their costs when they get to the point where they can operate a detail have been invested in the well. They paid for the drill, they paid for the frac job. They want to make that money back. Yeah. So using your own reservoir as the lab, I mean, that's an expensive proposition.
Well, to give you an idea, over my 40 years, I've seen some interesting things happen in the oil field. One of the most interesting things I ever saw was an operator. So I won't get myself in too much trouble.
Of course, don't name any names.
I saw an operator that would turn wells back onto production within 15 minutes of us shutting down the frac operation. They would be flowing that well up the casing back to production.
Okay, and generally, how long do you wait between those two things?
Well, usually, I mean, if you're really, really good, you get the wells online in, 3 or 4 days, like after you get everything going. But these guys, they were piped up to flow it back in a backflow mode to unload the frac fluid within 15 minutes of us shutting down.
That's amazing. So, I mean, the frac crew themselves haven't left the well pad at that point.
No, everybody's
it's almost a space issue on the surface.
It's just SIMOPS kind of problem, so you just deal with it and you make sure you got it handled from a safety
standpoint. Earlier you were talking about sometimes you want to wait for this fluid to propagate.
What they were doing, their theory was that they needed to get this fluid off the reservoir as fast as possible. And these were wells that predominantly, and these were Barnett shale wells, let's say that, and a time when you had $10 gas. Okay,
Oh,
so they wanted that stuff off the formation as fast as possible to get as high a rates as they could initially get.
$10 gas is a strong motivator.
So the unloading, I guess the reason I give you that a little sideline is the unloading process needs to be driven by the right pieces of information so that you're reaching what is the true goal on the company. If it's a short-term revenue creation situation, yeah, a long-term delay, that's, I'm
makes sense.
putting myself.
You may not believe the gas is going to stay at $10, and so you're willing to degrade your reservoir to get it out sooner.
I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get.
But generally, you'd want to wait a couple of days. It sounds like.
It's just the reality of getting everything out of the way, getting all the stuff cleaned up. In today's world, you're going to have to go back and drill up all these plugs, that you put in the well because you've done phased, you've done these step by step. One very interesting thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit later too, but Hess, I believe, is the company, just published their paper at the ERTEC meeting about these ADD. It just cracks me up, the ADD wells, but the augmented drainage development, I think is what they call it. So they're drilling wells that they're not fracking between two wells that they're fracking. Okay.
That's interesting. I've never heard of that.
Yeah, and so you're going to need to tweak your
how close are these wells?
Your satellite tracking technique, because you may not have a frac crew showing up on that one.
And yet you may have a producing well.
Yeah, and so what they're doing is they're drilling.
So it's just the communication between the wells is enough?
Yeah,
they get the benefit of the frac jobs?
Yeah, I'll use some oil field terms here. So I'm going to go frac the dog slobber out of these two that are on each side, and I got this well drilled in the middle. Okay? It's getting hit from both sides by these two wells. Maybe I'm doing what we used to call zipper mode, so I'm fracking one stage here, one stage here, one stage here, one stage here on each side of the well bore as I'm doing this operation. And that center well bore is just getting obliterated from fracks on both sides. But I don't have to frack it, and I turn it online. They started with them open hole. I think they're running like slotted liners into them now or something like that. But I worked in the microseismic but one of the guys that worked there is Craig Sapola, and Sapola is now with Hess, and you'll see papers published by Craig in drainage development wells, and it's a very interesting concept that goes to this till process, right? Because if I'm able to create a new flow potential, these are all Bakken wells as far as I know, is where they've been doing this. If I'm able to create a flow potential in a well that never got actually injected in, but I connected to the network of all these wells that got injected, all right, then that gives you some confidence of the permanence of the fracture network, because if this is just a, like, we always argue in the oil and gas business, how far does the proppant travel down the fracture face, if you will, before it gets either caught up or stopped or whatever.
This is one way of proving that.
So
if you get communication to a well in the middle,
if that well stays online and it keeps producing, and I never pumped frac proppant into that well, then the ends of this fracture network have to still be open. It's required.
Yeah.
That well would die off instantly if I took the pressure off of it, and that thing didn't have anything keeping it open. It's going to just collapse. And so it starts a whole discussion on, well, if I just crack the rock, am I getting enough? Do I need to prop it? So you got all these other discussions that'll come from this, but that type of approach, when you start looking at your production piece, it starts to give you more confidence that this crack I've created has a lot more permanence to it
Yeah.
than maybe we thought.
That's how it comes back to
initially.
DTILs is you have a better understanding of the permanence of the fractures. And so
Yeah.
you're less concerned about the impacts of a longer delayed till.
Yeah.
So, there's some well pads up in the Northeast, they'll have 35 plus wells on them, right? Are you talking about on the same well pad, I only frack a portion of these and I get the benefit from the other one? Or are you
Yes,
talking about...
I'm going to lay one lateral here, one lateral here, and right between the two, I'm going to drill this.
Okay, but there would never be a case then where I have another well pad somewhere else where I would use this. The fractures don't travel that far?
Typically, you have to be careful about too much generality, and then it depends on...
Yeah, well pads in the Permian, by the way, can be right next to each other.
Yeah,
well
it
pads in the
depends-
Northeast are miles apart.
Depends on the depth and the spacing and the fluid volumes that are being pumped and all these kind of things. There's a lot of variables into whether or not things between different pads are in communication.
Yeah.
But in general, that's the number one thing that goes into this calculation of where do I put them, is how much of the rock can I contact. When I did Pinnacle, a guy named Mike Reitmeyer and I worked on a paper. Steamer. Guys, you don't get it in the shale world. And so think about a volumetric block around this lap. Okay, this block has a certain network I've created inside of it. And so volume is what I'm really trying to do with the fracture. And so the size of that volume on each one of the wells becomes a key metric in spacing,
Yeah.
in how many pads do I need, what's my metric on length versus drilling and no. Those are the kinds of metrics that come up in that kind of piece. But you've seen people go out and load a well while they're fracking other wells, trying to keep this well from getting blown up.
What does that mean, load a well?
So they would go out and they would put diesel or some kind of very treated water system into the lateral, pressuring it up with liquid when they're going to frack next to it. Okay, so they had this parent well that was maybe on these pads, and now they're doing these, what we call the child wells coming next to them. Well, that parent well, they've maybe had 2 or 3 wells that have just gotten totally blown up from these other frack wells, and have caused them to be filled with debris, filled with sand and junk, and they got to go in and do a really high dollar expensive clean out to get it back online. I've seen people load those wells up with liquids and pressure it up to try and keep this frack from totally screwing up the wellbore, when it's happening. And so when you're doing these delayed production, these long-term till a big deferment period, one of the things that you're going to find is you did the frack and the pressure was real high, okay? And the pressure slowly, very slowly continues to decline till it's getting to where it's equalizing with some of the reservoir pressures. Now, if I'm doing a bunch of frack work around that well's pressure is going to be spiking up and down because it's getting hit each time I'm pumping these fracks in there. And so really long deferment times, I would be concerned if I'm not inside of an area that I controlled. When you get to where you've got multiple operators, suddenly you've got this little pad, this little thing that's a little gem that you're waiting to put on because you're going to get another $1.50 from them for the gas,
Yeah,
and,
but a neighbor could screw it up.
And then 2 weeks before that, your neighbor just blasts all the wells with something.
Is there coordination between operators? Do they help each other out and say, hey, I'm going to frack this well over
Yeah,
here?
they tend to try and screw each other over as much as possible.
Oh, the opposite of cooperation. Okay.
I think that the truth is, we don't want anybody getting hurt, and somebody's working on a well with a workover rig, and you're fracking right over there, and you're not telling them what's going on, you
could cause a
you
blowout.
can cause you can kill somebody.
Yeah.
So you've got to do the responsible thing and keep people aware of what you're doing. But as a guy that's running the workover rig, you also got to be responsible, saying, "Hey, I want to know what's going on around me," and make sure sundry notices or whatever the thing is that you're keeping up with to make sure.
What did you call that? A sundry notice?
Different terms in different locations. I don't even know what the current term in Texas is, but yeah, sometimes you have to file something in order to do some work on a specific well. And so, depending on what the regulatory group that you're dealing with is, you usually have to file a notice if you're going to do something. So, in the frac world, unfortunately, it's just part of the completion, and so it's usually a tracked activity because it's not online yet. But if I'm going to do an intervention, I'm going to put a rig on a well. Sometimes I'm going to have to file notice because I've got an aviation alert. I got something sticking way up in the air. And so I got to file notices to tell people, hey, we're going to this well, and here's what we're rigging up, that kind of thing.
Interesting. This conversation is actually kind of relevant to my next question. So you were talking about the spacing of wells and that kind of three-dimensional rectangle where you're draining hydrocarbons out of the rock. There's, for as long as I've been in this business, there's been discussion about, I think a long time ago they called it peak oil. But generally, I think that conversation has evolved to calling it more of, the best stuff has been drilled. The tier 1 stuff is out, right? Reservoirs or plays may reach their height and, all that's left is tier 2 or worse. And, it starts declining down. And I've never put much stock in those theories just because, anecdotally from my experience, it has never yet come to fruition. And I think that the criteria in order for that to happen would be pretty extreme. However, when at some theoretical point, right, these basins are going to have their best days behind them, when will we know when we're approaching that point?
Well, I guess if I have the answer to that, I really don't need to be here, right? I'm ready to go ahead and join Buffett and his group.
Of course.
But the interesting thing for me is if you look back to 1930 and go forward from there, there's been predictions of peak oil almost you can look in every decade and find this prediction.
Well documented in the book, The Big Rich, by the way.
There you go. So I've always thought it was hilarious that people would do that because for me, it's very clear. The price of hydrocarbons will always dictate what the reserves are. And the SEC knows that. So they give you a price forecast that you're required to run your stuff against to tell them what your reserves are. You've got to say, I'm economic at this number in order to do the reporting.
Yeah. So
people know that this is a cost and value driven decision, not a how many cans of beans are on the shelf, because that's what us old guys think. Well, look, the bean counters can just tell you how much oil there is, right? That's our joke, right?
Yeah.
Well, there's 2 or 3 things that people, or that I've learned over the time, that we constantly don't think about. We continuously reinvent this wheel. The first is technology changes, like we just talked about, the committed depletion development, drilling wells that aren't fracked. Okay. Well, just go back 15 years. We weren't even looking at shale development like this, Go back 20 years, all we were looking at was secondary and tertiary recovery projects inside of conventional reservoirs, So it's not realistic to think that technology won't change.
And what was tier 2 suddenly becomes tier 1.
Yeah. One of my favorites is the way offset things impact oil and gas business. Sandia Labs one time set off a small nuclear reaction inside of a tight gas well just to see how good they could crack it up.
It was the fun days of science.
Yeah. And man, they cracked it up. Unfortunately, the gas couldn't be produced for at least 150 years or something like that. It was
It's radioactive?
It was a little bit hot. Yeah. And so, there will always be some kind of technology that comes up that allows people to make a step change. And those step changes will always impact those numbers. The second part of this that no one wants to talk about, but to me is even bigger than technology, is the fraction of oil in place that's left behind when we, quote, finish producing a well. In these shale wells, it's enormous.
Really?
Oh, it's
More than 90%?
I would say most it varies by location. Again, Chuck, I'm saying it again, geology rules. The To put it in perspective, I worked the Kapark River field up on the North Slope of Alaska. I think the last numbers I saw, it's going to recover something like 86% of the original in place. It's some huge number between the water flooding and the EOR, the missile gas WAG flooding that they've done up there. It's just enormous. In a number of shale plays, you'll see recovery estimates of something like 8, 11, 12%.
You're kidding me.
No.
So I want to be clear on this point. When you're talking about the underground cube, right,
Yeah.
of what you're draining from the reservoir,
Yeah.
when the well is finally stopped producing,
When it's no longer economic.
there's still potentially 90% of the oil and gas left there.
Let's just make it easier, say at least 80%. That way somebody doesn't call and say, well, you're not calculating the way I do or something like that, But it's going to be
A majority. A
It's-
majority of the
it's
oil
a-
and gas has
it's a-
not been pulled out of it,
it's
even
a
the completely
freaking
depleted wells.
huge number. It's
And that's just
unbelievable.
because the technology doesn't exist to get it higher.
No, it's because of the other piece. When I talk about that stimulated reservoir volume block, I've got to put those cracks in contact with the formation. I can only place so many of those cracks per linear foot, if you will, okay? With these hydraulic tools, that's all I can do.
Yeah.
Somebody comes up with some
Way to pulverize it into sand.
AI-driven robot that's allows you to drill these little things and set a small explosive at each charge at the end of each thing
Yeah.
to create this massive fracture network that's 20 times more dense than what we got now. The number's going to change.
Yeah.
Okay. So you're dealing with the limitation of the economic technique that we have right now to recover those reserves. And that technology somehow will get changed. And when it does get changed, all of those places that were, quote, done suddenly become targets for recovery.
So the most important variable in the peak oil prediction then is technology, right? Because even if you did a very careful mapping of every single drill site in every single place, and you took current technology and said, this is what you can produce, right? The technology changes to become even a tiny percent better, right? It goes from 80% to, I'm going to get, I'm going to get 30%, right? So I've got 70% left. And all of a sudden, every single place that you've already drilled can produce 50% of what it already has.
And the part that people don't recognize is you already got the infrastructure put in place to do a lot of the work. I got all the roads in place. I got the drill pads in place.
So it becomes cheaper to come
I
back.
understand where the reservoir is. I understand.
Yeah, the mineral rights have been sorted out.
I got all this stuff sorted.
Yeah.
Now I come up, for instance, and I can't remember. Maybe it was Hess. I can't remember who it was. But a number of people have looked at gas injection with the huff and puff method. So they'll inject gas into a reservoir that has predominantly liquids, shale. Pressure it, let it sit, let it soak, let the gas go in there, and then produce it back. And get their liquids out of it, and then pressure it up again, and they'll alternate between wells on the pads. So it's somebody will come up with a technique, and that will change that number between both the price of the commodity and the technology.
Yeah. It's like people don't give the oil and gas industry enough credit for really being a technology industry. Right. They see it as almost a manufacturing business. You drill your hole in your ground, you get your commodity out, right? But all the nuances of everything you've been discussing today really just describe the huge technical challenges of maximizing these resources, and there's so much left to go.
What I just love it when you get some real redneck looking oil field hand, and he gets around a whole bunch of really well educated folks that want to ask questions of something, and then suddenly the man or woman just blows them away because he or she has shown that they have an understanding of certain physics and certain nuclear systems, or certain, it's just the amount of technology that we come across in this industry is enormous. Think about it. We're taking fiber optic cable, putting it down on the outside of a piece of pipe, running it underground for maybe 12, 15,000 feet, cementing it in place, perforating without poking holes in it, fracking it, using the sensors and transducers that are on this to monitor the performance of the well.
Yeah, miles underground where you can't see it, right? You can't go inspect it.
And you never get to look at it.
Yeah, and you don't have GPS, you don't have all these things. You're having to be very careful to even know where you are.
When you start thinking about those and those are things that we do a lot of times today, and if you start recognizing the ability of this industry to apply technology. That's what if you really wanted to know what's the difference between oil and gas and some other company or some other industry, it's the ability to apply technology. We don't care how much it looks good on a piece of paper. If I can't turn it into barrels in the tank or MCF in the pipeline, I'm not interested.
Yeah.
So show me how to apply it. And if it works out to where you can see it work, I will figure out how to make it go. That's what we do.
Yeah, that's very well said. All right, so for my last question, I wanted to do something a little bit more off the wall.
Oh, okay. All right.
This is also a hot topic on Twitter.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. A lot of people are proponents of the...
This doesn't have to do with Taylor Swift or anything.
Nothing to do with Taylor Swift, I promise. Unless she has an opinion on this, I'm not aware. A lot of people are proponents of the abiogenic petroleum theory.
Oh.
Give me your thoughts on that. Maybe you should describe what it is first.
Are you part of the Flat Earth Society?
I have no stake in this game at all. This absolutely does not impact anything we're doing at SynMax, but seeing the debate, I thought it might be interesting to get a very professional take on it.
Well, when you look at an outcrop of something, like say you're driving down the freeway and you see all the mine back or the cuts where they've made for fill that's used later on the road, you can see all the formations, the stuff that's underground exposed. Or you go to a big canyon, you go to Bryce Canyon or go to the Grand Canyon, you'll see all these different things that over geologic time show a change in composition, a change in fossils that you find, a change in carbon dating. Pick one. It varies by layer. To say, and if I understand the abiogenic thing correctly, they're talking about something that exists in the mantle is what's permeated to the surface, and all the creation of hydrocarbons comes from the same initial source. So I guess there's a whole lot of dinosaurs that were like looking up in the air in this transition from, like, I guess it's Cretaceous to Paleocene, when meteorites struck in the Yucatan and covered the earth in dirt for many, many decades or eons or whatever the time, a long time, that made a mess. That would argue that, there's some sedimentary issues going on when you kill everything off all at once like that. So my training from my geopsychic friends is very substantial in that I'm a big believer in the sedimentary process, and that the abiogenic creation process for hydrocarbons. But I guess since you've hit me with that one. I guess the one thing that I would say is most interesting, and hopefully I don't offend anyone with this, is if you have ever seen people develop landfills or landfill gas, you would have to believe that not all hydrocarbons are a source. Something under the mantle, okay? Because when you bury all of the stuff that we bury on landfills, I don't know if you've ever seen people do this before. You can go poke holes in those landfills after they sit there for a long enough time, and you can produce a really low-grade natural gas that if you just clean it up, you can use it. The generation organic decay of materials that are part of the sedimentary process is my personal opinion of where hydrocarbons go.
And the opinion of probably a majority of the experts in the field.
I would hope so, yeah.
Robert, this has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you very much. It was really interesting to have a visit, and good luck with your use of this in the freeze-off discussions.
Thanks a lot.
All right, thanks.